And the key to understanding Domain 3 is realizing that each law exists for a specific purpose and applies in specific situations. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Privacy Professional Training. In today's video, we're going to be continuing with our discussion on the CIPPUS preparation, and we're going to be talking about Domain 3 today, which is about government and court access to private sector information. So the focus of this domain looks at what happens when personal information that's held by private sector organizations becomes relevant to government activity or court proceeding. Now, for many students, this area can feel intimidating at first because it touches on law enforcement, national security, and civil litigation all at once. Now, what's unique about this domain, and specifically for the United States, is the privacy sphere is fragmented. There are laws in place that dictate how governments can access personal data. And the key to understanding Domain 3 is realizing that each law exists for a specific purpose and applies in specific situations. So how you're going to approach the CIPPUS is going to be very different to other geographies. And as we move through this discussion, I want you to think less about memorizing names and more about understanding why each law exists and when it comes into play. Laws that you are going to encounter in this domain. One of the first laws that you're going to encounter during your studies is the Right to Financial Privacy Act of 1978. Now, the reason we're starting with this particular law is because financial records have for a very long time been treated as sensitive under US privacy laws. And when we looked at the previous domains, we saw how the US does apply from a privacy perspective to certain sectors. Now, the Right to Financial Privacy Act was created to address concerns about government access to individual bank records. Now, at its core, this law is about placing structure around how federal authorities seek customer financial information. Now, this could be to varying degrees. It could be something as simple as the name and account information, and it could be records going back decades. Now, the law reflects the idea that people generally expect a level of privacy when it comes to their personal banking activity. Whenever this law appears, the focus usually is on an individual and/or customers and their financial records. Now, one thing that's very unique about the aspect in which this is covered for the exam is it's possible that you might encounter a situation where a federal agency wants information tied to a specific person's bank account. Now, the facts are going to be in a varying degree. It might be that a bank receives a request for customer level financial data. It could also be a scenario that mentions a formal request or legal paperwork like a subpoena. And you might also see details about whether the customer has been informed that this level of access by the government is going to occur. There's different situations that you might encounter related to whether the information is aggregated or anonymous, or is data that is raw in that you can identify the individual directly. In these moments, it's going to be helpful to pause and think about laws that exist specifically to address access to the bank records. This law tends to appear when the question centers on individual financial privacy, and you have to read this in collaboration with other financial privacy legislation to see what's going to be applicable for the question, and keeping those in mind helps clarify when this statute matters or is even applicable. The second law we're going to discuss related to Domain 3 is the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970. Now, the Bank Secrecy Act looks at financial information from a very different perspective. Instead of focusing on limiting access, this law is concerned with identifying and preventing financial crimes. It works to support systems that allow certain financial activity to be tracked and reported. So I think one thing that's consistent with the CIPPUS exam is looking at privacy from all different types of angles. The emphasis for this particular law is on detection and monitoring rather than individual notice. So we'll see that this law is closely tied to efforts to address fraud and money laundering. So this is something that impacts the government potentially directly and other laws outside of privacy. Now, some of the situations that you might encounter involve large or unusual financial transactions. There could be facts that describe reporting activity rather than a targeted request at one consumer. In addition to this, there may be no mention of an individual asking for privacy, and scenarios could also involve ongoing monitoring and investigation regulations rather than a single inquiry. This kind of setup often feels more regulatory than personal. So when we look at privacy, we're not just looking at privacy legislation, we're also looking at the impact it has on other regulation outside of the personal data. Obviously, that's very important. But when financial reporting appears routine or automatic, the law often becomes relevant, and it helps explain why certain information flows to the government. Recognizing this distinction makes the law easier to spot. So really looking at the facts that the question is going to present and understanding the nuances related to that law is going to assist you with your studies. The next law we're going to look at in Domain 3 is the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. Let's talk for a minute about communications that are central to this domain. Electronic Communications Privacy Act, often shortened to ECPA, governs access to electronic communications. This includes emails, stored messages, and certain communication-related records. One reason the ECPA can feel challenging is that it treats different kinds of data differently. How information is stored and what type of information it is both matter in this context. You might see a scenario involving emails held by a service provider. The facts might allude to making a distinction between message content and other communication details. The situation might describe stored data rather than interception, and you may also see references to things like servers, accounts, or electronic storage. These details are intentional and help signal which legal framework applies. When the focus is on electronic communications, ECPA often becomes part of the discussion. It helps explain how access rules change depending on the data involved. So when students are studying for the exam, slowing down to notice these details is especially useful in this area. The next law that we want to focus on in this domain is the Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act. The Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act, or CALEA, adds another layer to communications law pertaining to privacy. This statute is not about deciding whether surveillance is allowed. Rather, it focuses on whether certain providers are technically able to assist with authorized surveillance. Think of this law as addressing infrastructure rather than permission. It often works quietly in the background of other legal frameworks. So you have to think about this law in relation to other laws. You need to be able to reconcile what the similarities are and or differences in order to assist you with answering the question. It might occur in a situation involving telecommunication systems or networks, and there might be facts that mention technical capability or system design. There may already be some form of legal authorization in place, and the scenario might focus on how surveillance can be carried out based on what the law requires. In these cases, the issue is not whether access is justified. The issue is whether assistance is possible. That distinction helps bring this law into focus, and recognizing the role keeps CALEA from feeling confusing while you study for the test. So I really hope you enjoyed this review of Domain 3. We're going to keep on with the series. We're going to be looking domain by domain and what students need to look at in order to assist them with their studies. I'll see you in another video.